Battlefield 5, to the people who play it and those that follow news relating to it, has had its fair share of controversies. I would make a list of them, but it might go on for too long and we'd never get to the end of this video. So with that opener, it might be no surprise I'm talking about Nordlys, one of the war stories offered at the launch of Battlefield 5. In Nordlys, you play as a young Norwegian resistance fighter named Sylvig, who attempts to save her mother, who has been kidnapped and held at a deuterium plant in presumably Vemork. Now, I say presumably Vemork because the Nordlys war story is actually based on a real-life raid of said deuterium plant, codenamed Operations Grouse, Freshman, and Gunnerside. But we will get to the history later in the video. First, I want to do a brief rundown. This video, unlike my last Tiger analysis, shameless plug, will cover the story's overall quality in my opinion, the reaction the player base seemed to convey upon its release, and the relationship between historical authenticity and works of art. It's a lot to talk about, much more than in my previous video, so I want to dive in without wasting any more time. But first, I will give my general impressions on the war story as a whole. Nordlys was a war story that I had very mixed feelings with at first, but I have grown to appreciate it for its story, similar to how I feel about The Last Tiger now. The lack of historical authenticity and the protagonist being a young woman didn't bother me at all like it did some people, but much like the rest of Battlefield 5's single-player experiences, the missions felt pretty uninspired. I think in terms of gameplay, I likely had the most fun with this story, however that is not saying much. The skis are surprisingly enjoyable to use, but they are rarely ever a necessary mechanic. They do not assist in your actual missions, they simply take you place to place like any vehicle would, except more exhilarating than just driving a Kuba wagon. The stealth mechanics are fine, but many FPS games have done it better, such as Far Cry 3. Overall, in my opinion, it's simply nothing that special. One big plus I will give it though, is its visuals. Norway is, at least in my opinion, definitely the most beautiful of all the locations currently in Battlefield 5, and it's shown off really well in Nordlys, alongside some actual inspired cinematography, unlike what's done with the rest of the war stories. But with that said, we'll move on to the real nit and grit of the video. Firstly, there are two big complaints that I've personally seen when scrolling through people's opinions on the Nordlys war story on both Reddit and the Battlefield forums. Reason number one being the lack of historical authenticity, and reason number two being the fact you play as presumably a teenage girl, a young woman. I took issue with neither of these things like I said, but it got me thinking about the importance of authenticity in art, because it really is an argument as old as history and one that will likely never end, so I will give my 2 cents on the issue. Nordlys, as said previously, is based off a real-life operation conducted by multiple Norwegian resistance fighters in February of 1943 that sabotaged a German-occupied deuterium facility in Vemork, completely stopping all production of deuterium from the facility and severely harming the German efforts in researching nuclear technology. This is one of the most well-planned and well-executed covert operations of not only the war, but of modern history, and has been studied in great detail and influenced current special operations tactics and strategies. Battlefield 5 actually gets some things correct in its retelling of this sabotage. Originally, Operation Freshman, conducted the previous year by the British, was a complete failure that led to the deaths of every soldier involved besides the pilots that carried them there. British engineers were supposed to paradrop from gliders into the Norwegian mountains and link up with resistance fighters before assaulting the base. However, poor weather led to the gliders crashing, killing many on board while the rest were executed by German soldiers, as is portrayed at the start of Nordlys. Furthermore, the actual layout of the first mission, with the long, heavily guarded bridge and roadway leading up to the facility, is very accurate to the actual layout of the plant. The central buildings are nearly identical as well, with the only key difference being how you approach the facility. In Operation Gunnerside, the successful operation that led to neutralization of that deuterium plant, Norwegian resistance descended into the ravine and actually climbed up to the facility rather than trying to get in through what's essentially the front door. The choice to change this aspect of the operation was likely done for gameplay purposes, as it provides a larger, more open map to work with and leaves a lot of room for player freedom. In Operation Gunnerside, not a single shot was fired, and the resistance escaped without ever being detected. In Nordlys, you are given every option to kill as you wish, and can be detected without failure. The only stipulation is that you must survive. I've seen this brought up as a complaint about Nordlys and its historical authenticity, not just on Reddit or forums, but also by prominent content creators on YouTube. However, this makes the story no less authentic, because you are given the ability to kill. Operation Gunnerside was conducted with the idea of flexibility in mind. If a situation were to arise where the resistance would have been forced to kill to avoid detection and to complete the mission, it's highly likely they would have done so. Just because they didn't fire a shot in real life doesn't mean that they weren't prepared to. In Nordlys, if you master stealth mechanics, you can get through the whole first mission without being detected or killing anyone, up until you rescue Solveig's mother. It just takes more time and patience than most players are likely to have due to how poorly implemented the stealth is in some situations. Where the historical authenticity ends is with who was involved in Operation Gunnerside and the events that happened afterward. In Nordlys, the Nazi officer discovers Solveig and her mother, who then tosses her off a cliff, which is unintentionally really funny when you say it out loud, after handing her the plans to destroying the remaining deuterium in a nearby village. She then does that the next day. Afterwards, she attempts to save her mother again, who is being held at a nearby bunker where the last deuterium is being held. Once Solveig is discovered, the deuterium is immediately evacuated from the bunker and brought to a German submarine meant to transport it back to Germany. However, Solveig's mother manages to steal a grenade and blow up the remaining deuterium along with the submarine, sacrificing herself for a greater good. Solveig and her mother are completely fictional characters, as you might have guessed already, and none of the events after the retelling of Operation Gunnerside ever happened, at least not in the way that this is told. The German deuterium shipment was destroyed before reaching Germany, but was destroyed en route in a Norwegian ferry that led to a civilian casualty, but not while it was docked in a German submarine. This change in events, I believe, is least important, so once again I will talk about Operation Gunnerside. In real life, 11 saboteurs infiltrated the facility, successfully planted their explosives, left a Thompson submachine gun to indicate the British had conducted the operation rather than the resistance to prevent retaliation, then left successfully without being detected despite extensive searching by German soldiers. These 11 men were essentially replaced by one Norwegian young woman and her mother. Some might see this as an issue. There is a specific term used by some on the internet, and from what I've seen, it's mostly used incorrectly by alt-right commentators, take that as you will, called historical revisionism. It is a common thing in historiography. By definition, it is the reinterpretation of historical record either due to contrary evidence or a change in social values that lead to reinterpretation. Revisionism was once a term used most commonly to describe Holocaust deniers. However, those in denial are actually supporters of historical negationism, which is completely separate from revisionism. There are two terms that were brought up to differentiate between negationists and revisionists. The problem with revisionism, though, is its detractors, who will mistakenly believe that it is actually negationism. That those who revise history, for whatever reason, are actually in denial of what happened. Those who criticize Nordlys saying that it ignores the real history of what happened, I think themselves are ignoring what DICE was attempting to do with the story. It's clear DICE didn't simply ignore Operation Gunnerside and made up their own after reading some Wikipedia article about it. There are many details that remain true to real-life events, and when playing the missions start to finish, you can clearly see how it's less of a retelling of that actual operation itself, and more of a retelling of the Norwegian efforts as a whole to stop the German deuterium production, using it as a prominent example, especially considering the final mission that has Solveig destroy more deuterium in a completely different village, and her mother destroy the last shipment, losing her life in the process. What I haven't touched on yet is the relationship between art and the history it is based around. I would argue that video games in of themselves are a form of artwork, so I will proceed with that assumption in mind. To keep it short and simple, art based around historical events or figures is used to either honor or shame said event or figure, not to tell its history. Where I live in the United States, in Florida, a former Confederate state, we have had a recent desire among vocal groups in the communities to get rid of statues that depict Confederate symbolism or figures. The argument used by those who want to keep the statues standing is typically that these statues are how we remember history. Maybe if the statue has a plaque that tells you the biography of the person it is based on, that might make sense. But statues, like any other work of art, have no obligation to inform you on the actual history of what happened. Art can certainly become a part of history, but that does not mean that the artwork itself must be historically authentic. Furtherly, art based on real events does not have to portray something authentically to still honor it. Liberties can be taken with source materials to craft a story that still upholds the dignity of the people involved. The movie Amadeus, for example, also kind of spoiler alert, is a completely fictional story that uses historical figures, Mozart and Salieri. Although Salieri is portrayed as a murderer, which is untrue, and Mozart as crass and immature, which, in all fairness, is probably true, the movie still makes sure that we have this respect for them by the end, through Salieri's attempts to be the greatest composer to ever live, and Mozart's desire to enjoy his life and his music that comes to him so naturally. Amadeus honors the people for what they truly were, as brilliant composers with flaws, without ever portraying them accurately. Now for Nordlys, I can certainly understand the frustration. The people involved in Operation Gunnerside are not portrayed at all, and are replaced by fictional characters. But I think this ties into what I said before. Nordlys is not just trying to tell the story of Operation Gunnerside, but more a story about Norwegian resistance efforts as a whole. To tell that kind of story while still maintaining the same characters beginning to end, while also still basing it off of this historical event, I can't imagine would work if DICE had decided to portray the original 11 soldiers who actually took part in the operation in the way they did. If they had them fight at the deuterium plant, it wouldn't have been authentic at all for them to then continue fighting at the village in the next mission. Maybe they could have based the entire story off of Operation Grouse and Gunnerside, but I don't think that would make for a very exciting mission, considering the first half would be simply recon and the next half went off without a hitch, and they found the facility very unguarded once inside, which is also the case in Nordlys. The offices in the main building are nearly empty when there's only a couple patrols scattered around, but Nordlys has you infiltrate from the main road, where just like in real life, there are a lot of guards and defenses that keep it interesting. Nordlys is first and foremost a piece of interactive art, not a history textbook. Gameplay and story, in my opinion, should take center stage over historical authenticity in a game like Battlefield. I honestly have a bit of sympathy for DICE on this one. I really don't think any choice they could have made for a story based on Operation Gunnerside would have pleased both those that desire authenticity and those more concerned with the gameplay and plot. They likely could have gone with a different story, such as one based off of Polish, Greek, or Yugoslavic resistance, but none of those locations were represented at the launch of the game. And considering that DICE likely based the locations they'd represent in single player off of what they wanted to show in multiplayer, they might have just been working with what they already had, and trying not to stir up more controversy. Imagine if the game launched with a war story, set in Poland, but there was no Polish maps, no Polish cosmetics, or anything of that sort present in multiplayer. Hell, they still haven't even brought French uniforms, even though there's a whole war story based off of Operation Dragoon, but that's another topic for another day. Overall, Nordlys, I believe, was destined for controversy. DICE wanted to craft a story based on Operation Gunnerside, but the nature and mechanics of Battlefield are not suited for this specific historical setting. The structure they adopted for war stories doesn't lend itself to recounting the real-life events of 11 individuals. I was tempted in this video to dive into the firestorm that is the reasoning behind Solveig's character being a young woman and such, but I've decided I'd leave that for another video I plan on making after the war story analysis ones are completed, about representation of women in video gaming. I don't believe the topic was necessary to bring up to make my points here, so I'm leaving it for another time. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this second video essay from me, and lastly, if you disagree with anything that I have said, please leave a comment. I am always open to being proved wrong.